The man in the gray coat stepped out from the doorway and raised his voice over the rattle of a German freight train. "These people are under the protection of the Swedish crown." The sentence cut through steam, and shouted orders. Raoul Wallenberg held up a sheaf of yellow Schutzpässe stamped with a blue seal and the royal crest. Arrow Cross militiamen turned from the cattle cars where families huddled in the winter cold. A guard reached for the papers. Wallenberg didn't let go. He began to read names, calling each one like a roll that decided life. Men with armbands argued. He kept talking in calm Hungarian. A woman lifted a child down from the car and pressed forward. In the confusion, dozens slipped from the line and moved behind Wallenberg toward Swedish vehicles with flags on their fenders. The train pulled away lighter than scheduled. For the people left on the platform, he pointed to safe houses with a blue and yellow shield painted by the door. For a few minutes, Budapest felt like it had rules again. That was late 1944, when German control of the city was collapsing and the Arrow Cross government hunted Jews house to house. Wallenberg had arrived that summer, not yet 33, sent by Sweden at the request of the American War Refugee Board. He came with a diplomatic passport, a thick budget, and instructions to save as many lives as he could. He rented a suite in the Swedish legation, hired a staff of Jews and Gentiles, and began to build a paper wall stronger than most brick ones still standing in the bombed streets. The Schutzpass he designed looked official because he made it that way. The paper thick and bright, the coat of arms crisp, the language legal and confident. The pass declared the bearer awaiting repatriation to Sweden and entitled to immunity from harassment. He opened protected houses where thousands took shelter under the flag. He set up soup kitchens and clinics and bribed when he had to. At the Danube embankment, where Arrow Cross squads lined up civilians for shootings, he appeared with stacks of passes and a voice that didn't shake. He worked train yards, ghettos, police stations, and offices where clerks stamped documents without looking up. If a door stood in the way, he went through it or took the door off its hinges. By January 1945, the Soviet Red Army closed around Budapest. The siege shattered the city block by block. Wallenberg pushed through snow and rubble to reach Soviet lines. He wanted to secure supplies for those still hiding and to protect his network from being swept up as collaborators. On January 17th, he left his office with his Hungarian driver, Vilmos Langfelder, to meet Soviet officers. He told colleagues, "I don't know if the Soviets will arrest me or not. The worst they can do is kill me." He added that he was going to see Malinovsky's command, the front headquarters, to negotiate. He never came back. At first, rumors swirled. He had been seen at a Soviet command post. He had been escorted to Debrecen. He was on his way to Moscow with a guarantee. Weeks passed without a letter. The Swedish legation asked questions through diplomatic channels and received polite nothing. Families saved by Wallenberg showed up at the consulate to ask for him and left disappointed. In Moscow, the security service known as SMERSH, the counterintelligence arm of the Red Army, opened a file. The path that followed ran through prison courtyards with high ice-rimmed walls. Wallenberg and Langfelder were transported in stages across the front and taken by rail under false names. In the Lubyanka, the security headquarters in Moscow, intake clerks logged them with numbers instead of identities. Interrogations in small rooms under bright lights lasted for hours. Guards delivered thin soup and black bread. Prisoners learned not to ask for more. The Swede was the subject of questions that seemed to start in the middle. Where did he get his money? What were his ties to the Germans? Whom did he report to in the United States? What was the purpose of the Swedish houses in Budapest? In an age when espionage could be invented with a signature, a diplomat who had moved money, men, and paper in a collapsing city fit every suspicion. Sweden pressed for access. The Soviets kept their answers spare. They said they had no information. Months became a year. In 1947, a quiet note moved across a Kremlin desk. A brief internal memo, later released, stated that a Wallenberg, a well-known Swedish diplomat, had died in his cell on July 10, 1947, of a heart attack. The note carried the signature of a Lubyanka medical officer, and its language had the flat tone of an office obituary. It did not mention a place of burial. It did not admit imprisonment at all. When the Soviets finally acknowledged receiving him, they did so in 1957 in a communiqué from Deputy Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko. He repeated the claim of a heart attack and said the matter was closed. By then, people in multiple countries had reported sightings: a tall, fair prisoner in a Moscow hospital, a foreigner speaking Swedish in a barracks yard, a whisper of a man called Number 7. None came with proof, but several aligned too closely to ignore Wallenberg's mother, Maj von Dardel, and his half-brother, physicist Guy von Dardel, refused to let the case settle. They wrote letters, visited archives, met officials, and kept the question alive long after others called it hopeless. The Swedish government, cautious with a neutral's memory of wartime bargaining, moved slowly. Diplomats pressed in private and upset few dinners in public. The family did not stop through the 1970s and 1980s. The case made its way back into newspapers every time a defector mentioned a Western prisoner forgotten by his country. In 1989, with the Soviet Union cracking open, new searches began. A joint Russian-Swedish working group examined records and questioned retired officials. Lubyanka registers showed a prisoner number 7 interrogated on July 23, 1947. 13 days after the date, the Soviets claimed Wallenberg died. A former archivist said the designation was used for the most sensitive detainee. The identification was not definitive, but it deepened the question that had outlived the men who first signed the paperwork. Those who owed their lives to Wallenberg grew old, with their rescuer missing from every funeral. Survivors told and retold how he had stepped into a streetcar to shield them from a patrol, how he had dragged men off a labor column with a list and a bluff, how he had handed a pass to a woman who had no papers and said, "Now you do." In Israel, the United States, and Europe, he was honored with trees, medals, and honorary citizenships. Streets and schools took his name. None of it answered where his body lay. The search produced facts like stones in a stream, heavy, isolated, hard to move. Lubyanka records placed a Swede in custody. Lefortovo prisoner logs hinted at transfers. The medical note surfaced as an unconvincing end. The Soviet security bureaucracy had a pattern when an inconvenient prisoner died or was killed: a short entry, a vague diagnosis, a cremation without witnesses, and a grave without a marker. In that pattern, Wallenberg fit too neatly. If he had been killed, there was no paper admitting it. If he had died of mistreatment or illness, there was no paper explaining why the state had hidden his existence for years. In 2000, the working group ended without a definitive answer. Russia granted partial access to files and then closed doors again. Sweden issued reports that apologized for past hesitations but could only summarize the gaps. In 2016, after a final review of the evidence and with no remains located, Sweden issued a formal declaration of death with the date set to when he most likely died in Soviet custody. The family asked that the world remember what he had done and the government that took him without admitting it. The life is clearer than the end. Wallenberg was born into a prominent Swedish banking family, educated in architecture and commerce, energetic and direct. In Budapest, he moved like a reporter who wrote with documents instead of ink. He saved thousands by persuading officials to behave as if law still mattered. He took risks that had the feel of sense rather than bravado. He traveled to the front, expecting to negotiate with the incoming power, because that was the next step in protecting the people he had promised to protect. The Soviets arrested him, because they did not trust anyone who had worked with multiple governments inside a city ruled by enemies. What they did after the arrest was what closed systems do. They filed him away. In an office in Stockholm, a wooden box holds the desk items returned to the family years later. A passport never stamped again, a few banknotes, a notebook with names, and a driver's license for a city where the car never moved. In Budapest, restored houses still wear plaques that say, "Protected by Sweden," in 2 languages. At the Danube Bank, a memorial shows bronze shoes lined along the edge where people once stood. The water slides past them day and night as if it were new water each time. Somewhere beyond the bridges, the exact spot where Wallenberg walked onto a road and into Soviet custody has no marker. It doesn't need one. Every question that followed begins there. The last confirmed facts fit in a paragraph. In January 1945, a Swedish diplomat and his driver were detained by Soviet authorities in Budapest. They were taken to Moscow and held without consular access. No verifiable record of their fate has surfaced. A Soviet memo claims death by heart attack in July 1947. Years of testimonies and fragments suggest he may have lived longer. The rest is absence shaped by a name. What remains certain is what he already finished before the arrest. Families were spared, transports turned, and doors opened that would have stayed closed if he had not been there. The city he tried to save rebuilt itself after the war. The country that took him collapsed and then reassembled with a different name. His story fits in both places because it speaks a language officials understand and sometimes fear. One person acting as if a piece of paper can hold back a gun. He proved that for a while, it can. When the papers couldn't shield him, he went on anyway. That is the final record, even without a grave. Thank you for listening to Last Post History. Subscribe for more true stories from the world at war.